President Donald Trump continues to look for ways to address record beef prices. Montana Senator Steve Daines says ranchers have been very vocal about some of the president's actions. Over the past few months, Trump suggested importing foreign beef and decided to cut back on beef tariffs. Daines says the best course of action would be to support the local meat producers.
The answer is to find, number one, expanded markets for us to export to allow us to grow our herds and export more beef, but also to streamline some of the regulations in terms of grazing permits and so forth to help our ranchers at this time.
Daines says he's also keeping an eye on the DOJ's investigation into the 4 major meatpacking companies, with President Trump accusing them of price fixing.
When you take a look at the price that the rancher receives, on the hoof versus what the cut meat received when it leaves the packers and so forth, there's a significant disparity there.
Some of the reasons for the high price of beef include significant demand and the United States having the lowest herd count since 1951.